Thanks for coming to see me. In a different day and a different venue, but change is good. I'm getting what I asked for from South by Southwest in my speech last year, so I'm not going to complain much. A lot of tech art at the event this year, just heaps of it. Even Hans Ulrich Obrist was here. I was truly thrilled to see this extremely hip entrepreneur of the art world here in Austin. This bodes well, I think. I was surprised to see so many politicians talking to each other at South by this year. Just heaps of politicians. I mean, more politicians than there were rent-a-scooters. This is a sea change for the event. We're going to see more of this. The town's growing and densifying. There's some exotic new buildings since last year. New York-style pedestrian crowds in Austin now. A lot of young people, which is an American advantage, an Austin advantage. Town's got the pains of success. It's got high rents. It's got traffic and so forth. Here's the Austin Chronicle from the week of the event. You can see it's got a cyberpunk dystopia on the front page here. Now, it's, there's holes in the skyscrapers, fires, floods, unemployment, debris all over the bottom, and then in the corner, South by Southwest, week 1. It's like, come on, Austin Chronicle, this is your own event here. You just can't tell the guests that all hell is breaking loose downtown. I mean, you're supposed to be a city booster, all right? You're supposed to iron your shirt for this, Tighten your belt buckle, put your best foot forward. You're getting all jaded here. You should try to compare the pains of a growing city like Austin to a town that just isn't growing or is shrinking, or growing just a little like Turin, which is the city I flew from to be here, Torino. I'll be flying there again after this. So, what's new for 2019, Bruce? I mean, I always say these things at these Bruce Sterling speeches, besides climate change getting worse, because I always say that at every South by Southwest event, and it's always getting worse. It's just, okay, well, there's a new thing in my life for 2019, which is also a very old thing, and it is a villa. It's a palace. It's this palace here, this villa. It's called the Villa Abegg in Torino, also known as the Vineyard of the Royal Madam. So in Turin, I get involved in some strange adventures as a cultural activist. It's a European city. It's got a great many old buildings. So in some typically complicated European situation, I ended up working inside a palace. It's too complicated to explain all the palace intrigue that got me into the palace, but I'm in fact in a palace in Turin, pretty much all by myself in a huge 4-story palace. So the owners were moving out of this palace, so the wife and I agreed to help them to try to find some new tenants. And the owners, who were the Company of St. Paul, they will give this huge historic villa to you rent-free. Just move in and work. But you have to repair the palace, and you have to pay to maintain the extensive palace gardens. That's the pitch there. So my palace, the Villa Abegg, has got a secret tunnel. It's got a weird Edgar Allan Poe basement. It's got an artificial lake with its own little island that has a theater on it. It's got carpets, chandeliers, statues, paintings, but it's been pretty much empty for an entire year, for 12 months, except for the occasional tourist group that comes through, and me and the wife, the Duchess Yasmina, up in residence in the attic of the palace, typing away on our laptops. So our villa, which is 4 stories high, heavy brick walls, ornamental stone, giant frescoes, it would be pretty much perfect for George Soros or Bill Gates to like install a charity or maybe liberate a country or cure malaria or something. That's what should be happening in a building of this kind. But the $150,000 a year for maintenance costs would have to be a line item for the new palace occupant. Not exactly an easy client to find. You need a guy who likes to tame white elephants. And also it would be best if somebody agreed to move in for 60 years. Because the foundation that owns this palace is 500 years old and the palace itself is 375 years old. And that's my palace. And at the moment, they mostly use the palace to store cyberpunks in. That's its purpose. That's the value proposal for the Villa Abegg for a year so far. Yes, here in Turin, we've got this American cyberpunk writer, and he needs some place to write his novels. So we got him stashed up in the attic of the palace. Sometimes he cleans some dust off the garret windows. Got a writer's office there. It's a creative residency at a Turinese palace for an entire year. I'm starting to worry. I'm starting to worry about what becomes of my palace. I can't stay in there alone indefinitely. What happens if the palace goes to the dark side? Because that wouldn't be new. The dark side is kind of standard behavior for my palace, actually. The vineyard of the royal madam has a long checkered history because it is the place where the Dukes of Savoy used to hide their lovers. It's a covert love nest, and if you were the official girlfriend of the Duke of Savoy, you had to stay out of the way of the Duchess inside this palace. Just imagine the centuries of bitter, covert intrigue that must have gone on inside there. Now, you may say that my old palace is spooky and haunted and has Italian ghosts running around inside it. But this is the 21st century, and frankly, my palace is wired to the gills with broadband. It's a rather high-tech palace. It used to be a big modern research library. And so it's pretty much a perfect hideout for a modern master computer criminal. You could hardly imagine a better covert fortress than this rich, distant villa hidden deep in the hills of Turin and surrounded by a giant brick fortress wall. Like a Russian mogul oligarch could stay in there and like meddle with votes. Or you could put a Bitcoin mine in there, or a Monero mine, which would be worse, or a OneCoin mine, which is the worst of the worst. Or you could put a black market dark net node inside this palace, or fill it up with stolen Facebook data, or maybe a Huawei 5G Chinese cyber war threat to NATO security. Like a villain super palace from a techno thriller. And this subject comes up too, because every once in a while curious people drop by to see me at my palace, like this consortium from Milano, which is the next town over. Some clever Milanese guys I happen to know. They're from the Milanese venture capital scene. They're tech scenesters from Milan. Big town Milan, a lot of money in Milan. They think Turin is cute and charming. It's a relationship very much like Houston and Austin. These Milanese guys kind of throw their weight around. So they come to see me and they're like, wow, Dr. Sterling, because they call me that in Europe. This palace of yours, this must be the most cyberpunk palace in the world. And it's the Phoenix Renewed project, if you want to look that up. You can Google Bruce Sterling, Phoenix Renewed. You can see what we've been up to in the palace for a year. We're really there. I wouldn't lie to you. If you're an American tech philanthropist, you got money to burn, please feel free to make an offer to move in before some Milanese investors arrive. They could do something terrible to my beloved little Turinese villa. But, having framed it that way, wait a minute. Does it really make any sense for a Baroque 17th century palace in Italy to also be cyberpunk? That palace is 375 years old. It was built in the 1640s. But now that you bring up the subject, cyberpunk is pretty old too. Like, cyberpunk is older than the World Wide Web, which is 30 years old this month. The World Wide Web appeared in 1989, which was a great year, by the way. While Mirror Shades, the cyberpunk anthology, was published in 1986, like 3 years earlier. So, who is the most cyberpunk person in the world in 2019? These Milanese consortium guys are inquiring of me in my palace. Is it you, Bruce Sterling? Are you the world's most cyberpunk person? You were the first guy to publish a book with the word cyberpunk in the title, and you wrote like the official cyberpunk manifesto. And I told these Milanese guys, I just said flat out, no, it just can't possibly be me. But it is kind of an interesting problem. Maybe I should deliver an entire speech at South by about the social condition of cyberpunk in 2019. I should just get into the tall weeds there. So let's just get right after that, shall we? So first, is cyberpunk actually dead? It's 33 years old. Is cyberpunk a historical phenomenon? Yeah, obviously it's sort of dead. But if it's dead now, then when was it alive? And what does dead mean, when you're talking about a literary movement? Well, in 1986, there were 10 science fiction writers in Mirror Shades, the cyberpunk anthology. And I must point out, not one of them is actually physically dead. They're science fiction writers. They're the kind of people who write violent techno-thriller dystopias about cyborg ninjas. Obviously, they're not living in a real dystopia because every one of them is alive. They've all reached retirement age, not one drug overdose, not one suicide, which for creative writers is really amazing. They're fantastic. I even know where they are in 2019. I know the location of every cyberpunk. They're in Vancouver, London, Seattle, Raleigh, Los Gatos, California, a village in New Hampshire, in the attic of a Baroque palace in Turin, and so forth. And they've even got a cyberpunk email list now, a private list, and they're all talking to each other, mostly complaining about politics and gossiping about publishers, like all other science fiction writers do. But they're an active group of writers who self-identify as cyberpunks, and they're not dead people. They're even more into cyberpunk than they've been in a while. They're kind of engaged with it. They find it funny. And then there's a new generation of science fiction writers who have read a ton of cyberpunk stuff, and they know all about it, but they understand that it's become old-fashioned. Cyberpunk is not modern. It's 33 years old. It's not up-to-date speculative fiction. It is a subgenre that people who were in their 60s and 70s created 30 years ago. So, it's not that cyberpunk died and vanished and had no further influence. On the contrary, the cyberpunk of the 1980s and 90s was a lot like its predecessor, which was the new wave speculative fiction of the 1960s and 1970s. Now, I think it's pretty safe to declare that the new wave is dead. If cyberpunk is dead, then the new wave is certainly even deader than cyberpunk. And you can consider new wave writers like Harlan Ellison, who was my literary mentor, first man to ever publish me, and J.G. Ballard, very well known today, has a rather high literary reputation. They're deceased. They're no longer with us. They are historical figures. It's a fact. So when Ballard was dying, he even wrote his very last book, which was an autobiography called Miracles of Life. And it was a book motivated by his awareness of death. So Ballard knows he is in slow decline. But he's not just going to sit on his couch and watch cricket on British TV. He's putting his cultural house in order. It's a very personal book, Miracles of Life. It's not very exciting. It's the dullest Ballard book. It's an old man's book. It's contemplative, kind of boring, but old men can read it because it's about a topic which of direct interest to them, which is inevitable mortality. So Miracles of Life, his last book, is mostly about life and not really much about science fiction, but some of it is about science fiction. And Ballard says that he thought science fiction was a truly interesting literature and that it had a bigger potential than people understood, but he was never able to get science fiction to do what he thought it should be able to do. And I think that recognition is the true death of a literary movement. When you've got a guy who's really good at it, inventive, there for the whole thing, and he says kind of ruefully, well, I thought I had some great concepts and approaches, and I took this as far as I could, and I achieved some stuff, but then I figured out there was something wrong with it, and it was somehow just not fit for purpose. That's when the movement stops. When the practitioners admit to themselves that it's just no more use moving there. There's nothing moving. Now, J.G. Ballard was a medical student, and he knew a lot about psychoanalysis. So he wanted to write a kind of intensely visionary science fiction that was beyond psychiatric help. That was his goal, to be beyond psychiatric help. It's not crazy writing, it's quite sane actually, but it's just so far out there that medical professionals are baffled. Experts on the work of the brain have nothing to say. The straight people are mind blown by it. They're rendered mute. It's like Andre Breton believing that surrealist paintings will cause capitalism to implode. That's what Ballard was attempting to do as a writer. He thought that a truly powerful science fiction text ought to be able to cause a revolution of the mind. And you can see an inheritance of that in Cyberpunk, because you got a lot of Cyberpunk texts which are about the human condition imploding, a science fiction sense of ecstasy and dread that is permanent, a black swan that wrecks consensus reality. We're going to become cyborgs. We will be post-human. We will be amped up genetically, cybernetically. And it's not that that doesn't happen in real life. It's more like 30 years do pass, and then people arise who try to do real-life cyberpunk post-human stuff, but they're like grinders on nootropics with a lot of tattoos, and they're kind of mildly annoying people. So I don't think cyberpunk is dead yet in the same way that J.G. Ballard is dead. In fact, I think Ballard is setting quite a good public example by being so serene and accepting about the twilight of his life. It's an attitude I respect very much. I take his point. He is my literary predecessor. I acknowledge that gratefully. And I actually met J.G. Ballard once inside a London art gallery, and he was dressed up in a very sharp white suit, and he looked very much like a hip 1960s pop artist. And I was immediately doing my fanboy thing, oh, my great pleasure to meet you, maestro, and so on. But Ballard wasn't having any of that. Instead, he told me that he had heard that I was getting some science fiction done and that I ought to buckle down and try to do something new and worthwhile. And I think that was the right thing to say. I would not dream of telling a young science fiction writer today to write like a cyberpunk. And to write like Ballard, exactly like Ballard, is also useless. But to be ambitious like Ballard is the proper thing to do. He is dead, but that is his legacy. Now, the new wave is dead, but the ocean is not dead. When a wave crashes to the shore, that's not a tragedy. It brings fresh oxygen, and as the ocean is there, there will be other waves presently. So I'm not upset about the mortality of literary movements. To have cyberpunk be dead or alive or in a state of half-death or half-aliveness or even a cyborg state, that doesn't really bother me much. If cyberpunk is older than the World Wide Web isn't looking all that great either. And Sir Tim Berners-Lee will be the first one to tell you that. However, when this Milanese consortium puts me right on the spot, like, where is the cyberpunk maestro? I have to recognize, the complexity of the question. They have a right to ask me a question like that. I can't just shrug it off. I need to try to help them. They're intelligent people, they're modern people. They're educated, they have capital, they're young, they're up to all kinds of mischief. They deserve some response. And what's more, these Milanese consortium guys were not the first Milanese people to give me that problem. The first Milanese people who confronted me as a cyberpunk were some extremely punk people 30 years ago living in Milan, and they were a counterculture publishing house from Milan, or a social movement, really, called Shake Underground. So these Milanese punks from Shake Underground had published and translated an American cyberpunk book, and I was signing the translation inside one of their squats in Milan, which was a derelict Italian building that these punks had simply invaded and taken over. And they were paying no rent in there. They just seized the building. They didn't pay any more rent than I pay rent in my weird palace now. And they were Milanese cyberpunk squatters with computers. And I asked them, so what happens if the police try to make you pay rent? And they told me, then we riot. Now, I felt a little embarrassed that we American cyberpunks didn't riot. Scarcely at all. But we didn't have any squats to riot about, which is a lack on our part. And I realized at that point that something important had happened. We American cyberpunk writers were science fiction writers who were making up an imaginary sensibility called cyberpunk. But these Milanese cyberpunks were not science fiction writers. They wanted to live it. They wanted to be it. They saw it as their game plan for modern civilization. They were living illegally in squats and social centers. They were alternative and confrontational and oppositional. And they were publishing radical material on bulletin board systems and sharing covert information that never appeared in public. They were disaffected radical European youth rebels who were way into new media. They were 1989ers. Now, I think we all ought to admit that the Shake Underground people of the 1980s were more cyberpunk than American and Canadian cyberpunk novelists. It's sort of okay to admit that. It's like saying that women who read romance novels are more romantic than the women who write romance novels, which, if you think about it, I feel sure is true. Now, it's not that cyberpunk writers weren't cyberpunks at all. On the contrary, they were very into it, really exploring the possibilities. It was other science fiction writers who quickly turned cyberpunk into a formula. When they saw that cyberpunk was becoming popular, they didn't want all the trouble or risk of actually being cyberpunk or thinking about digital transformations in a futuristic and visionary way. No, they were just professional entertainers, and they wanted to sell some books. And they left a legacy too. It was they who invented all the cliches of cyberpunk. So that's what you see now if you do an image search with the word cyberpunk. You will see some very formulaic images, lots of them, thousands, memes almost. Young women with high-tech guns, Weird sunglasses, black leather, a lot of artificial limbs, VR goggles, Japanese neon, big cities, always at night, cyborg police in riot armor, people with rather large 1980s headphone jacks, which are literally jacked into their heads. And to see this doesn't hurt my feelings any. I'm not a graphic artist myself, and it's kind of interesting that our texts were able to generate so much of this viral fan material. There's a lot more steampunk dress up than there is cyberpunk dress up, and that was a pretty good trick too. But what surprises me today is how much of this cyberpunk imagery is new. It's not the old cyberpunk imagery continually recycled. People still create it, heaps of it. And you don't really see very much cyberpunk imagery from its heyday in the 1980s and 1990s. The fans have forgotten that cyberpunk used to have big, blocky pixels in it. Modern fans don't realize that computer graphics used to be really primitive and bad. Also, if you search for pictures of cyberpunk, you will never see an actual photograph of an actual cyberpunk science fiction writer, like, say, Rudy Rucker or Pat Cadigan. Cyberpunk fans do not stalk us, unlike Neil Gaiman, who's got goth fans who follow him around, cult style. We cyberpunks have escaped this torrent of cyberpunk imagery that we provoked. It's at arm's length from us. It's like something safe in a thermos bottle. Now, even when we were writing a lot of cyberpunk science fiction, the cyberpunk writers tended to write stuff that wasn't cyberpunk at all, such as nonfiction, tech, journalism, opinion pieces, historical fantasies, steampunk, horror, game design, movie scripts, comics, lyrics for heavy metal bands, design criticism, learned introductions to work by Jules Verne. In other words, cyberpunk was something that we could create as writers, and not something that we were as people. You don't simply volunteer to become a cyberpunk. You don't raise your hand and say, put me in the anthology. I mean, that's not how it works. A literary movement is some working writers who get grouped together by the tenor of the times. And time passes, and nowadays, I'm just not particularly cyberpunk. When I show up in public like this, I generally get described as author, journalist, futurist, art critic, something like that. But that's because I outlived the vogue. If I had died here in Austin in the year 1999, Y2K style, New Year's Day 2000, I'm pretty sure that I would be regarded as the most cyberpunk person ever, because I would be dead. I would be the exemplar of cyberpunk because I lived fast and died young. I would be fixed in the past time. I would become iconic. I would personify it, like the late Stevie Ray Vaughan and the 1980s Texas blues scene. Because he's forever Stevie Ray, you see. That towering figure in bronze, guitar in his hand. He's not Grandpa Stevie Ray, still among us, wandering around the 6th Street crowds during South by. So when these Milanese guys ask me, well, what about the most cyberpunk person in the world? I have to offer some answers, and I have to try to justify them. And I offer two dead women, actually, who I think may very well be the most cyberpunk people ever. And the first was a Japanese new media artist named Seiko Mikami. When I was visiting Tokyo in the boom of the 1980s, I was hanging out with the staffers of a Japanese science fiction magazine, and they told me, well, since you're a cyberpunk, obviously you have to meet Seiko Mikami. And they took me out to this derelict Tokyo barn full of broken machinery. And there was this lively Japanese personage in there in a big fur hat. And she was just crazier than Yoko Ono, just welding and soldering stuff in a mess of flickering TV screens. In her barn, there was just a buzz of public activity. It was impossible to describe how inspiring and muse-like she was. She was like an exotic Pacific Rim character from a William Gibson novel, but she was actually alive and laughing and zooming around on a rusty motor scooter. and a very warm-hearted and generous person. She was thrilled to meet me, and she even gave me a personal gift of a little sculpture that she had made out of melted transistors. Because the Japanese are very keen on gift giving. It's a big part of their culture, and just a cool gesture on her part to a visiting writer. And later, Seiko became a design school professor so that she could pay to make her cyber installations, which were huge and had titles like Gravicells and Design of Codes. Now, she was never a science fiction writer, but after meeting her, I immediately started taking new media art people with a lot more seriousness. I actually recognized that they were cultural allies of mine. Seiko Mikami really opened up my parochial horizons and what I felt I ought to be up to. I thought, well, she's not a writer, but I am a writer, and I have to write about people like her, and I have to validate them, and I have to valorize them, and I have to champion them. Now, Seiko got sick, and she died in 2015. But in some ways, her new media art will always be new. It belongs to her in some way. High-tech media installations become obsolete. They're dead media pretty quickly. But not her. She's together with them, as cyberpunk as it is possible to be. And the second woman was also a creative, less well-known than Seiko Mikami. She was an artist in Turin named Maria Bruno, which is to say, plain Mary Brown. Maria Bruno. And Maria Bruno was an Italian street artist. She used to use the tag name Sister Flash. But she also really liked internet art, web art. Maria liked any kind of art that was free, radical, shareable, and outside the soul-crushing commercial gallery scene. She was just, information wants to be free, my art wants to be free, I'm a free spirit, I will help, I will contribute, I will organize, I will work, and not at all chatty and boastful about her ambitions. On the contrary, it was always deeds, not words with Maria. She was married, she had a child, very punk hairstyle, a lot of tattoos, super alternative, but a very calm, tall, focused woman. In the Turinese technology art scene, she was the activist's activist. If people were just talking in a room and Maria was in there, something was going to happen. Again, not a science fiction person, but hard to beat for the authentic, intense, and heartfelt combination of cyber and punk. She got leukemia for no particular reason, swept her away in a matter of weeks. Never likely to become a famous person. Even her street art was more about her community than it was ever about her. But really, when it came to the culture of cyberpunk, Maria Bruno made me feel like a hobbyist. I felt like a dilettante, even. It might be impossible for anybody to ever get more cyberpunk than Maria Bruno, because her era of shareable, free, radical internet cyberculture is over. The context of her actions is gone. They're historic. Now, Italians have a rather tangled relationship with science fiction. They didn't invent it, but they took it over. They have their own variety of it, which is called fantascienza. So what Italians are most like cyberpunk science fiction writers? Well, they're a fantascienza literary movement called the connectivists, the connettivisti. Giovanni De Matteo and Sandra Battisti, Marco Milano, Luca B. Cremo, they were a movement, literary movement, mostly Romans, in 2004, on computers, writing literary manifestos, sharing theoretical ideas about science fiction, writing science fiction fanzines. So I know them. And what am I supposed to do about them? They're a science fiction movement which is definitely not dead. As Italian fantascienza writers go, the connectivisti are pretty on top of their game in 2019. They're publishing their own anthologies, they're winning the big awards, they attract mainstream attention, they get studied in universities, all that good stuff. What can I do with these Italian latter-day cyberpunks who are into their own thing? Well, I participate. I try to write connectivist stories. They try to write a philosophical fantascienza, which is about the nature of being within radical technological change. They're very Roman, they're soulful, they're European. They're into spiritual adventures and the Lovecraftian Internet of Things, weird singularity experiments on the primal shores of being. That's very connectivist rhetoric. I try to keep up with what they're doing. I try to be friendly to them. I am not the most famous Texan fantastic writer in Italy. Italians adore Joe Lansdale. Even connectivists truly love Joe Lansdale. If you're a cyberpunk writer in Italy like me, people want to store you in a palace someplace. It's like, let him go be over there. You're like a creature from a flying saucer. But Joe Lansdale, writing weird swamp fantasies in Nacogdoches, which is what he does. That is an Italian's idea of what Americans ought to be writing. They just totally dig the guy. I would not claim that Joe Lansdale is the most cyberpunk person in the world. In fact, it's impossible to make cyberpunk the measure of the world. It's like trying to measure with a rubber ruler, or even two rubber rulers like bendable, flexible yardsticks, because punk has changed a lot and cyber has changed even more drastically than punk. Now, 20th century punks like myself were often middle-class dropouts, but the 21st century so far has been all about middle-class force-outs. The 21st century has been a sordid tale of income confiscation and wage theft, where people who want to be the bourgeoisie are forced to live like starving artists, whether they like that or not. They're getting punished. Now, as far back as the 1830s, there were people living like dropout bohemians, and they had a lifestyle with some standard characteristics, such as the lack of any stable residence, endless housing crisis, weird, useless politics, a whole lot of dangerous narcotics around, kinky, transgressive sex habits, scraping by on creative gigs and art odd jobs. That's bohemianism from the 1830s. There's nothing new about that. But that is normal life now for everybody who's forced downward out of the middle class. Whatever happens to musicians will happen to everybody. So everybody's like a bohemian musician, except much less cool about it. They become involuntary beatniks. They're crushed into that role. So to valorize beatniks in your science fiction stories is kind of corny and passé in 2019. It just doesn't make much political sense. If you read politically aware modern science fiction today, you'll see that it's got a lot of grave concern with excluded classes of people like gender and race and behavioral minorities who are being shut down and shut out. It's the science fiction of a post-consumer society where daily life has become precarious. And that's what they write because that's what's going on. Now, modern science in 2019 is even worse off than science fiction is. The morale of scientists is lower than the morale of science fiction writers. Scientists get kicked around more. They're disrespected. They're dismissed. You don't see much science fiction written which recognizes this, that understands that Jeff Bezos, who used to be a science fiction bookseller, is the richest man in the world. And modern, successful science fiction writers are not grimy, Grub Street, punk, comic book kinds of street people. There's still a few of them around, like the old school blue-collar pulp writers, but the heavy modern science fiction writers tend to be educated men and women with PhDs and day jobs in non-governmental policy operations. Young SF people now are super educated and erudite by 20th century standards. I'm kind of old for that intellectual gentrification wave, but even I have been known to lecture on postmodern media philosophy in Switzerland. And South by this year was just swarming with science fiction writers, packs of them. I went to their panels on artificial intelligence. It was alarming how well briefed they were. They weren't even bothering to make stuff up. They actually understood it. In some ways, there's just too much money and power for science fiction to be street level now. It's not an electronic frontier. It really is an electronic aristocracy now. And it likes science fiction writers to become its courtiers. So we might ask, who is the person in 2019 who believes that he is the most cyberpunk person in the world? And obviously it's Elon Musk, who was here last year. Jeff Bezos is a formidable visionary who reads a whole lot of science fiction. But Elon is a guy who clearly imagines himself to be the charismatic hero of a science fiction adventure novel. Elon really wants to go through his life generating a sense of wonder about himself. And I don't mind him doing that. I mean, my philosophy is to let Elon be Elon. I don't care much what happens to his investors or even his car buyers, but I think people ought to be more in touch with what he's doing. He's building a shell of brand glamour around himself that's based in sci-fi tropes, such as cyberpunk brainwave readers and Martian rocket ships and dystopian threats from artificial intelligences. And yes, that stuff is all sci-fi bullshit. But it's a lot less bullshit than the truly horrible, moldy real estate bullshit that surrounds Donald Trump. And that's why people find it refreshing, and they quite like the look of it on Elon, but it's still hokum. And down market from Elon are a host of modern people among us who would make really great villains in 1980s cyberpunk thriller novels because they are genuine, high-tech lowlifes. In 2019, we have a crumbling world financial order and tremendous financial corruption, and also omnipresent computer communication, a kind of guerrilla war by the rich and the crooked against democratic norms. And it's just a petri dish for sinister cyberpunk bad guys, GRU special forces people with weird classified nerve poisons, American henchmen of crooked Ukrainian dictators, kidnapped Chinese princesses from giant Chinese smartphone companies, Canadian Bitcoin moguls who drop dead in India, weird influencer supermodels on gigantic super yachts, Israeli private investigators selling trafficking software to Saudi millionaires in Cyprus. There's armies of them. We're surrounded by these bad actors. There are literal cyber war battalions of them. Now, I'm not saying that my beloved cyberpunk palace in Turin is doomed to go to the bad here. Because I don't want to prophesy, dystopia along this line. But sometimes when I'm sitting up there in my office, in my attic, my bohemian garret, alone, reading these truly sinister developments in my Twitter stream, I can literally feel the pressure of corruption. My palace was built by Machiavellian rich people of the 30 Years' War. And it is a structure that properly ought to be occupied by rich, power-hungry, vainglorious aristocrats. And nowadays, they ought to be really high-tech ones. People could be tapping phone banks in there. They could be managing killer drones in my palace. They could be running huge bot armies of fake sock puppets. They could be laundering offshore money. Now, I'm not saying that I am doing that myself in my palace, but it is definitely an activity that is taking place outside the boundaries of science fiction novels. It is a true crime world of top-level decay and state mafia spook activity. And I could write a novel about it. And that would be a novel of the kind that William Gibson, my colleague, calls now punk, which is just to write a rather standard cyberpunk thriller novel that's set in the present day with present-day technology. However, the tech and techno-thrillers has never been all that thrilling to me because it's not speculative technology. And in 2019, cyber stuff is our everyday stuff. It's banal. It's in our pockets. It's in our purses. It's with us all the time. It's like trying to get all thrilled about the science fiction wonder of receiving an SMS from your Uber driver, which is pretty amazing if you think about it from the perspective of the 1980s. But if you think about it at any length, you have to recognize it as an act of political and economic oppression. Now, cyberpunk writers in the 1980s were a lot more realistic than most people understood at that time. But I once wrote a cyberpunk novel which was set in the year 2020. And next year it actually will be 2020. So should I write a straight, realistic novel about the year 2020 because the future caught up with me and cyberpunk is reality? Look, even if cyberpunk is reality, science fiction has to be speculative. But I'm interested to have this as a creative problem, though. This is my reward for having lived so long. It's like this. You spent a lot of time making computers glamorous. And they became glamorous. And they were glamorous for a very long time. But now, like all things glamorous, their sense of wonder has drained away. Big tech is disgusting to people. At South by, the Europeans are showing up to tax it. Left-wing senators want to turn the platforms into public utilities. Cyber war is at hand. The military is in the building. The Chinese are standing right next to them in Austin as they promote a new cyber Cold War. And the levels of bald corruption and theft that surround stuff like financial tech is just a crisis. It's beyond scandal. And nobody launches amazing new startup products here because there are no amazing new startup products. Industry consolidation is set in. It's the era of big tech. The Big Nine, GAFM, BAT, FANG, the G Mafia. What are you supposed to do about it, Dr. Cyberpunk? Well, I know that people would prefer for me to be all disillusioned about this and kind of down in the mouth about it, but I'm not, because that attitude is childish. It's like being a playwright who writes ingenue roles for a beautiful young actress. And then your actress marries, and she becomes a matron of 50, who is the mother of 5. Now, you can't weep and moan about that process. She's not 19 and pretty anymore, but she is the mother of Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. They may not be the nicest kids ever born, but boy, are they ever big and strong. And even if the big tech platforms are not as nice as some optimists said in the past, they're not as bad as some pessimists say now either. If our attitude about them was bullshit in the 1990s dot-com boom, it's much more bullshit right now because there's so much more general bullshit around. There's just trouble all over the place. And what specific places, though? I mean, the most cyberpunk people in the world, hard to figure out. What are the most cyberpunk places in the world? And that's an interesting question. Well, I could tell you all about that, because I travel a lot. I'm a travel writer. I have no problem identifying the places. They are Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, Shanghai, Tokyo, Mumbai, Los Angeles, Shenzhen, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Cape Town, Panama, Luxembourg, Tallinn, Copenhagen, Dubai, London, Gibraltar, Kabul, Lisbon, Malta, Puerto Rico, Berlin, Milan, Brussels, Astana, all of Somalia, Bangalore, Linz, Barcelona, Seoul, Las Vegas, Frankfurt, Belgrade, Beirut, Austin, Boston, Caracas, Havana, Pyongyang, Moscow, and Kiev. And maybe Turin, but I don't know. I'm still of two minds about that. On mature consideration, probably not. Now, I can't explain to you how I know all of that, but I just do. I'm a recognized expert, okay? You'll have to take my word for that. And what am I supposed to do about all of it? Well, I've just run out of time to explain it. I just can't go any farther with this. I guess I'll just have to do it. Come ever what may, deeds, not words, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention, and see you next year.